You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The funeral was on a Thursday. Rain hammered Giuseppe's grave like bullets, turning the dirt into black mud that stuck to everything it touched. I stood there with maybe 12 other people, mostly neighbours who barely knew him, listening to a priest mumble prayers in Latin that sounded more like curses than comfort. My grandfather had been 87 when he died. Heart attack in his sleep, the doctor said. Peaceful. But there had been nothing peaceful about finding him 3 days earlier, sprawled across his kitchen table with his eyes wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. His mouth was open too, like he'd been trying to scream. The house was mine now, a narrow 3-story building in old Palermo, squeezed between a bakery and a shop selling plastic saints to tourists. I'd visited maybe 6 times in my life, always feeling like I was trespassing in the old man's perfectly ordered world. Giuseppe Viale had been my father's father, but they'd hated each other. Something about the war, my dad used to say before changing the subject. After my parents died in that crash when I was 22, Giuseppe sent flowers and a note written in careful English, but that was it. I knew he'd worked as a translator, spoke 8 languages, and never married. That was everything I knew about the man whose secrets I was about to inherit. I drove to his house the morning after the funeral, planning to spend a few days packing, maybe find some family photos, letters that would tell me who he really was. The lawyer mentioned he'd left me everything. The house, some investments, and instructions that I handle his affairs personally. The moment I stepped inside, every nerve in my body started screaming. Not because anything was obviously wrong. The house was immaculate, organised with surgical precision, but there was something in the air that made my skin crawl. A quality to the silence that felt like held breath. Like the building itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. The kitchen was spotless, not just clean but sterile, like an operating room. The living room looked like a museum exhibit. Even his bedroom was pristine, the bed made with military corners, and not a single personal item visible anywhere. It was his study that made me stop breathing. The room was lined with books, but not normal books. These were academic texts, in languages that I couldn't identify, some with scripts that looked like mathematical equations, others with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. On his desk sat a magnifying glass, 3 fountain pens arranged in a perfect line, and a leather blotter with a single drop of what looked like dried blood in the corner. I spent the first day searching obvious places. Closets full of identical black suits, medicine cabinet containing only aspirin and bandages, kitchen drawers that held exactly what they should, and nothing more. It was like he'd lived his entire life expecting inspection. But it was the basement that changed everything. I found the entrance behind a bookshelf in the study, hidden so well I almost missed it. The shelf swung inward on silent hinges, revealing stairs that descended into absolute darkness. The basement wasn't part of the original house. The walls were carved stone, the floor rough concrete that looked hand-poured. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Against the far wall sat a cedar trunk, old and scarred, positioned like an altar. When I lifted the lid, the smell hit me first. Preservatives and something organic that made my stomach lurch. Inside were documents, photographs, letters tied with black ribbon. And underneath everything else, wrapped in oiled cloth, Something that made me drop the lid and stumble backward. A human skull with a hole drilled through the forehead. The bone around the hole was polished smooth, like someone had spent years perfecting the technique. But the trunk felt wrong, heavier than it should be, even with the skull inside. I forced myself to examine it more carefully, running trembling fingers along the interior until I found the hidden seam. A section of the bottom popped up, revealing a compartment I never would have discovered by accident. Inside was an envelope sealed with wax so dark it was almost black. The seal bore a crest I recognized immediately. 2 crossed keys beneath a papal crown, worked in gold that seemed to pulse in the basement's harsh light. The Vatican. But this wasn't any official correspondence, no address, no postmark. Just that papal seal pressed into wax that felt warm, despite the basement's chill. I carried it upstairs with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Whatever was inside, Giuseppe had hidden it carefully. Maybe I should respect that. Maybe I should burn it and walk away. Instead, I broke the seal. The wax cracked like breaking bones, releasing a smell like burnt hair and copper pennies. Inside was parchment so old it looked ready to crumble, covered in text that made my vision blur, just trying to focus on it. At the top, in script that seemed to writhe, Elenco delle strutture obscura, Ufficio di contenimento ecclesiastico. Below that, an inventory. Dozens of entries in neat columns, each with a number, location, and designation. Some were crossed out in what looked like dried blood. Others had notations in margins, dates and phrases that made no sense. Site 23, Monastery of Sant'Angelo. Status, purged. Site 41, Catacombs of Santa Priscilla. Status, monitored Site 58, Basilica of San Clemente. Status, breached. The list continued for pages. Churches, monasteries, catacombs, places that sounded familiar but felt wrong in this context. Then I found the entry that made the world collapse around me. Site 77, Santa Lucia Sepulcher, designate Nathan Vale. My name. My full name written in the same script as everything else. Below it, a handwritten note in different ink. Observation terminated, pending handler's death. Subject unaware of designation. Under no circumstances engage without archivum nigrum authorization. See attached bloodline analysis. There was no attached analysis, just my name on a list of what appeared to be Vatican black sites. I poured Giuseppe's whiskey with hands that wouldn't hold steady. 3 fingers, then 3 more, sitting in his leather chair and staring at those words until they burned into my retinas. Handler. Someone had been watching me my entire life, managing me, and if I was reading this correctly, that someone had been my grandfather. Back in the basement, I searched the trunk more thoroughly. Hidden beneath everything else was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Giuseppe's handwriting filled every page, entries going back 40 years, documenting someone's life with scientific precision. My life, school records, medical appointments, career decisions, relationships, everything chronicled like a case study, like I was a lab rat being observed for some vast experiment. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. Subject shows no signs of manifestation despite optimal age parameters. Bloodline contamination possible, or containment protocols too effective. Cardiac episodes increasing, time short. When primary handlers assume control, immediate evaluation required. May God forgive what we have done to this family. The pact should have ended with me, but they will never allow that. They never do. I closed the journal and sat in that basement, trying to process what I'd discovered. Giuseppe hadn't been a quiet translator. He'd been part of something much darker, connected to the Vatican's most secret operations, and I was the next subject in their experiment. The smart move would have been to burn everything and run. But the mention of Santa Lucia Sepulcher had embedded itself in my brain like a fishhook, and I knew I wouldn't be free until I understood what it meant. I spent a week researching, diving into academic databases and conspiracy forums where people shared fragments about the church's hidden activities. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Vatican has always had departments that don't officially exist. Not just political or financial, but things that deal with phenomena outside accepted reality. The Office of Ecclesiastical Containment investigated supernatural activity, maintained custody of dangerous artifacts, and monitored bloodlines touched by forces the church couldn't simply explain away. Santa Lucia Sepulcher appeared in several obscure papers about abandoned religious sites. A monastery built into cliffs near Matera in the 12th century, operated by an order whose name had been systematically erased from records. They weren't traditional monks, but guardians, though guardian of what was never specified. The monastery operated for 7 centuries before being abandoned in 1887 after a landslide. But locals had been avoiding the area long before the disaster. Stories spoke of monks who visited villages only at night, carrying bundles wrapped in black cloth. Worse were accounts of people who sought shelter at the monastery. Some never returned. Others came back fundamentally changed, speaking unknown languages and displaying impossible knowledge. The landslide had been remarkably convenient. Too convenient. Like someone had decided the site was too dangerous and arranged for nature to seal it permanently. But landslides don't always stay sealed. Recent satellite images showed the cliff face with gaps in the debris field, spaces where decades of erosion had worn away the barriers. Santa Lucia was accessible again. I told myself I was just curious. I'd drive down, take photos, maybe understand Giuseppe's involvement. It seemed reasonable. But I was lying to myself. The drive to Matera took me through increasingly desolate countryside. I stopped for lunch in a village where the elderly restaurant owner's face went pale when I mentioned Santa Lucia. "You shouldn't go there," she said, disappearing into a back room and returning with a wooden box of old photographs. She showed me one of the monastery before the landslide, an imposing structure carved into the cliff face with multiple levels following the rock's natural contours. But it was the windows that made my blood freeze. In several of them, dark shapes stood watching the camera. Human figures that seemed wrong somehow, their proportions slightly off. "This was taken in 1885, she explained. "My great-grandfather was the photographer. He said the figures never moved the entire time he worked. Just stood there watching." She pointed to one window higher up the cliff. The figure there was clearer than the others, wearing brown robes, but with hands pressed against the glass that looked too long, too thin. He swore it followed him home, not physically, but he'd see it in reflections, always watching. It drove him to madness before he finally fled the region. She showed me another photo, the monastery's interior, a circular chamber with stone benches arranged around a central altar. On the altar sat something partially wrapped in dark cloth that I couldn't identify. "The monks there weren't normal," she said, gathering the photos quickly. "They weren't praying for souls or helping the sick. They were keeping something that should never have been disturbed." Her hands shook as she closed the box. The mountain fell for a reason. Some doors should stay closed. But even as she spoke, I felt that hook in my mind pulling tighter. I thanked her and drove toward the mountains as afternoon shadows lengthened into something that felt like reaching fingers. The road to Santa Lucia was barely a dirt track winding through loose rock and scrub brush. Faded warning signs in multiple languages marked the landslide area. Danger. Unstable ground. Do not proceed. But someone had been here recently. Fresh tire tracks scored the dirt, and the warning signs were covered with graffiti in what looked like Latin. I parked where the road ended and continued on foot. The cliff face loomed ahead, a vertical wall of grey stone with a massive debris field at its base. But Erosion had carved channels through the fallen rock, creating passages that led back toward the original structure. It took an hour to work through the debris field, following what might have been a path between the larger boulders. My hands were bleeding by the time I reached the cliff face, but there it was, a split in the stone partially hidden behind the twisted remains of an iron gate. The gate hung open, not just unlocked, but torn from its hinges. Deep scratches scored the metal, gouges too wide and too regular to have been made by any tool I could imagine. Beyond the gate, the monastery entrance tunneled directly into living rock. The walls were polished smooth, decorated with niches containing small statues. Many had been damaged, faces worn away, or deliberately destroyed, but their poses suggested terror rather than reverence. The air inside was wrong, colder than it should be, and heavy with smells that didn't belong together. Old incense mixed with something organic and rotten, like flowers, left in stagnant water. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate to the main corridor, which extended much deeper into the cliff than seemed structurally possible. Most chambers I passed were empty, but some contained evidence of the monastery's true purpose. Stone tables with restraints built into them. Walls covered in inscriptions that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. Iron rings set into floors and ceilings, positioned for holding something large and unwilling. In the deepest part of the complex, I found the stairs. Carved directly into bedrock, they spiraled down into absolute darkness. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and halfway down I started noticing the markings. Tally marks scratched into walls by the hundreds. Latin phrases that read more like warnings than prayers. And everywhere, small handprints pressed into stone, as if the rock had been soft when they were made. The staircase descended far below any foundation, so deep that my ears popped from pressure changes. I counted steps to stay calm. 200, 300, 400. At step 512, I reached bottom. The passage opened into a natural cavern, so vast my flashlight couldn't reach the walls. But someone had modified the space extensively. The perimeter was lined with alcoves containing stone sarcophagi, and spanning the center was a narrow bridge leading to a circular chamber carved from solid rock. The chamber was maybe 20 feet across, its walls made of polished black stone that reflected my light like dark water. No other entrances, no windows, just that single bridge connecting it to the main cavern, like an island floating in an ocean of darkness. Inside the chamber, something was waiting. I crossed the bridge on hands and knees, too aware of the drop to trust my balance. The stone was slick with moisture that seemed to seep from the rock itself, and my palms kept slipping despite constant wiping. The chamber's entrance was an archway carved with decorations that made my brain ache when I tried to focus on them. Not because they moved or glowed, but because they suggested meanings my mind couldn't process, like words in a language that existed before human thought. Beyond the archway was a room that defied everything I thought I knew about medieval engineering. The walls formed a perfect circle, polished to mirror smoothness. The floor was a single piece of black stone with no visible seams, as if the entire chamber had been carved from one massive geode. In the center, on a raised platform, sat a stone altar. On the altar was a book, ancient beyond measure, bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light itself. Chains of some unidentifiable metal wound around it multiple times, held by what appeared to be a wax seal that pulsed with its own rhythm. But it was the figures surrounding the altar that made me cry out and stumble backward. Life-size sculptures made of wax, positioned in a perfect circle facing inward. They wore flowing robes carved in exquisite detail, hands clasped in prayer or supplication. But their faces were wrong. Not melted, but deliberately reshaped, features flowing together like heated plastic. And as I moved my light from figure to figure, sick recognition dawned. They all looked like me. Not exactly, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. Same bone structure, same build, same features I saw every morning in mirrors. Some appeared younger, some older, but all sharing genetic markers that screamed blood relation. Generations of my family, preserved in wax and arranged around whatever was chained to that altar. On the far wall, carved deep into stone, an inscription in Latin, Hic iacet vas, reditum expectans. Here lies the vessel, awaiting the return. Below that, in letters that looked freshly carved, Nathan Vale. I stepped backward, breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed strangely in the circular space. My flashlight beam wavered, throwing wild shadows that made the wax figures seem to shift and breathe. That's when I noticed the book was breathing, subtle but unmistakable. A slow rise and fall, like lungs filling and emptying. And the seal holding the chains wasn't wax at all, but flesh. Human flesh, pale and translucent, formed into a seal shape and somehow still alive after unknowable years. My phone's flashlight flickered once, dimmed, then died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, something moved. Not the book or the wax figures, but something else. A wet, sliding sound like fabric dragged across stone. Then, footsteps with intervals that didn't match any human gait. Too heavy in some places, too light in others. I fumbled desperately with my phone, managed to revive the flashlight, but the beam was much weaker. In that dim light, I could see one of the wax figures had changed position. No longer facing the altar, but turned toward me, its reshaped features arranged in what might have been a smile. Then I heard my name, not called or shouted, but whispered with harmonics that shouldn't exist in any human throat. Nathan Vale. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off chamber walls in ways that made locating the source impossible. As it spoke, the book's breathing became more pronounced, the flesh seal pulsing with what looked like a heartbeat. I ran, across the bridge, through the cavern, up those endless stairs with pursuit echoing behind me. Not footsteps, but something worse. A scraping, sliding noise like something enormous being dragged across stone. Whatever followed was gaining ground, and I could hear my name whispered over and over in that impossible voice. I burst into evening air, gasping and shaking, clothes soaked with sweat and hands bloody from scraping walls in my desperate escape. Behind me, the entrance had gone silent, but I could feel something watching from darkness just beyond the dying light. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Then sat there 20 minutes with engine running and doors locked, staring back at that dark opening and waiting for something to emerge. Nothing did. Nothing visible. The drive back to Palermo was torture, winding roads and shapes in the rearview mirror that might have been imagination. I kept the radio loud, desperate for any sound to drown out the memory of that voice whispering my name. But even with noise, I could still hear it echoing in my skull, like a song I couldn't stop humming. By the time I reached Giuseppe's house, I'd almost convinced myself that stress and atmosphere had created the entire experience. I'd found old ruins, let them affect me, and my mind filled in blanks with horror movie imagery. But when I looked in the bathroom mirror, that comfortable delusion shattered. There was wax in my hair, small flecks of pale, translucent material, like I brushed against melted candles. I picked at it with trembling fingers, and when I held it to the light, I could see it wasn't ordinary wax. It was the same substance I'd seen sealing the book, living tissue somehow preserved and shaped, warm to the touch and pulsing with its own rhythm. I showered until hot water ran out, scrubbing skin and hair raw, but couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. Not physically present, but connected in ways that transcended normal space and distance. That night I dreamed. But these weren't normal dreams. Too vivid, too detailed, too consistent to be products of sleeping imagination. I walked through the monastery as it had been centuries ago, when monks still lived there and conducted rituals in chambers beneath the mountain. I saw them in their daily routines, but these weren't conventional religious observances. They were something else entirely. Ceremonies involving the book, the wax figures, practices that had nothing to do with Christian worship. The monks weren't praying for salvation or ministering to spiritual needs. They were guardians, watchers, keepers of something requiring constant vigilance to prevent catastrophic escape. And in every dream one would turn to look at me with my own face. Waking was worse than dreaming. Each morning brought evidence the dreams weren't entirely imaginary. Dirt under fingernails I'd scrubbed clean before bed. Shoes by the front door, damp with moisture that smelled like monastery depths. Feet sore and blistered like I'd walked for hours on rough stone. On the third morning, I woke to find a small figure on my dresser, a wax sculpture 6 inches tall and crudely made but unmistakably human. It wore robes carved in surprising detail, and its face was a distorted mirror of my own features. In tiny hands, it held what appeared to be a miniature book bound in dark material. I threw it away immediately, wrapping it in newspaper and burying it deep in the garbage. But next morning, it was back. Same position, same pose, same unsettling resemblance that made my skin crawl. I threw it away again, and again, and again. It always returned. That's when I started researching my family history with desperate intensity. I called distant relatives, dug through genealogy sites, tracked down every record about the Vale lineage. What I discovered made my dreams seem pleasant by comparison. The Vale family had a relationship with the Vatican, stretching back centuries, not as faithful servants but as subjects of study. Test cases, breeding stock for something the church had been monitoring across generations. My great-great-grandfather, Pietro Vaile, had been part of an experiment conducted by the Office of Ecclesiastical Containment in the 1890s. Records were fragmentary, scattered across archives and written in codes that took weeks to decipher, but what I pieced together painted a picture of systematic observation and manipulation spanning decades. They'd been investigating bloodlines, genetic markers, hereditary traits that weren't entirely natural, families touched by forces the church classified as supernatural and needed to monitor, control, or contain. The Vale family was one of dozens under observation, but we were special, more promising, more suitable for whatever long-term project they were conducting. I found reference to Santa Lucia Sepulcher in a 1923 document describing it as a containment facility for hereditary anomalies requiring extended observation. The monastery hadn't been abandoned because of a landslide. It had been sealed because whatever they kept there had grown too powerful for traditional containment. But sealing isn't the same as destroying. Professor Benedetti at the University of Rome helped me understand the scope. He was 80-something, officially retired, but his knowledge of Vatican history was encyclopedic, and his willingness to discuss forbidden topics suggested previous encounters with this material. The Archivum Nigrum, he told me over a phone connection crackling with static, officially doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's one of the oldest departments in Vatican hierarchy, predating modern papacy by centuries. What do? Monitor and contain supernatural anomalies, phenomena that don't fit official doctrine but can't be dismissed through conventional means, sometimes involving artifacts or locations, sometimes people. People like my family. Long pause before he answered. Certain bloodlines carry genetic markers, making them suitable for specific purposes. The church has been tracking these families for generations, guiding their development, ensuring traits remain strong. What purposes? That depends on the case, sometimes beneficial, healing gifts, prophetic abilities, enhanced spiritual sensitivity. But sometimes, his voice trailed off. Sometimes what? Sometimes involving service as vessels for things much older and more dangerous than human understanding can safely encompass. The word vessel hit like a physical blow. What does that mean? It means you should forget this conversation and leave Italy immediately. But I couldn't leave. The pull was strengthening daily, drawing me south towards Matera like a fishing line, reeling me in. During daylight, rational thought was possible. But as darkness fell, something else took control. Something that had been dormant in my blood for generations, waiting for proper conditions to fully awaken. Dreams were becoming more frequent, more vivid, and I was remembering things that had never happened to me personally. Standing in that circular chamber as a young man, watching Giuseppe perform rituals with the chain book. The weight of chains in my hands, taste of words in languages I'd never learned flowing from my lips like I'd spoken them forever. Most clearly, I remembered agreeing to something, making a choice that bound not just me, but everyone who would come after me in the family line. The realization struck like lightning. Giuseppe hadn't just been watched by the Archivum Nigrum. He'd been one of their assets, a willing participant. And when age made him unsuitable, they'd transferred attention to the next generation. To me. I tried to run, booked a flight to Chicago, packed belongings, arranged to sell Giuseppe's house. But sitting in the airport terminal waiting for my boarding call, I felt it starting. The compulsion, beginning as mild discomfort like hunger or thirst, something ignorable if I focused elsewhere. But it grew stronger, hourly, becoming physical need that made my hands shake and vision blur. Like a metal cable attached to my sternum, pulling me inexorably south. I fought it 3 hours, gripping plastic armrests until knuckles went white. Other passengers cast concerned glances, probably assuming flying phobia or medical emergency. If only it had been that simple. Eventually resistance crumbled. I cancelled my flight and rented another car, driving back toward Matera as sunset painted the sky the colour of dried blood. The pull was strongest after dark. During day, rational thought remained possible, but as shadows lengthened, something else assumed control. Something dormant in my bloodstream, for decades, waiting for the proper moment to manifest. I drove through night, stopping only for fuel and coffee I couldn't taste. Roads were empty, just endless asphalt cutting through countryside that looked increasingly familiar, despite never having travelled these routes before. Or had I? Memory was becoming unreliable, mixing personal experience with inherited knowledge until distinguishing between what I'd lived and what I'd inherited became impossible. By dawn, I was back at Santa Lucia. The monastery looked different in morning light. Not abandoned ruins, but expectant, like it had been patiently waiting for my return. The iron gate stood completely open, and I could see someone had been maintaining the entrance. Debris cleared from pathways, fresh candles placed in wall niches, floors swept clean. I walked through those passages like coming home. The descent to the circular chamber was easier this time, feet automatically finding worn spots in stone steps without conscious guidance. Wall carvings were clearer now, and I could read Latin inscriptions as fluently as English. Warnings about premature awakening dangers, instructions for rituals maintaining containment. Everywhere, tally marks recording time passage in units I didn't recognize but somehow understood intuitively. The chamber was exactly as I'd left it, with one crucial difference: the wax figures had moved, still arranged around the central altar, but now facing outward, towards the entrance, toward me. And their faces were no longer melted or distorted. They were perfect, clear, each depicting a different stage of my life with photographic precision. One showed me as a child, maybe 7, with the serious expression I'd worn in school portraits. Another depicted me as I was now, down to clothes I was wearing, and exhaustion etched around my eyes. But others showed me at ages I hadn't reached yet, growing older in ways suggesting this wasn't my first visit and wouldn't be my last. The book on the altar was open, pages fluttering in sourceless breeze. Chains lay in neat coils beside it, flesh sealed nowhere to be seen. As I approached, I could see writing on yellowed parchment, words that shifted and changed as I watched but remained perfectly legible regardless of script. They were names, hundreds stretching back through centuries in an unbroken genealogical chain. My family tree, recorded in blood and binding agreements and promises made in darkness. Each entry included dates, locations, brief descriptions of roles they played. Pietro Vele, 1847 to 1923, first vessel, covenant established with Archivum Nigrum. Antonio Vele, 1923 to 1967, second vessel, bloodlines strengthened through selective breeding. Giuseppe Vale, 1967 to 2019. Third vessel, prepared fourth generation for manifestation. At the bottom, written in fresh ink gleaming wet in candlelight, my own name followed by Giuseppe's careful handwriting. Nathan Vale, 2019 to present. Fourth vessel, the covenant continues. Understanding crashed over me like a tsunami. This wasn't about worship or faith or anything the church publicly represented. This was about power. Ancient power requiring biological anchor, family lineage to flow through like electricity through copper wire. Something existing long before Christianity, learning to adapt, hide within acceptable religious frameworks while pursuing its own agenda. My ancestors hadn't been victims. They'd been partners, willing participants in a covenant trading ordinary human existence for something far more significant. They'd carried this entity in their genetic material, allowing it to grow stronger each generation until ready to manifest completely. Now it was my turn. I reached for the book without conscious decision, hands moving with inherited muscle memory. Pages felt warm under fingertips, alive in ways that made my nervous system sing with recognition. As I began reading, words rearranged themselves on parchment, Latin transforming into English, ancient promises becoming contemporary commitments. I spoke aloud without deliberate choice. The wax figures around the altar began changing as I recited, not walking or gesturing, but melting, flowing, becoming something liquid and purposeful that pooled around the stone platform's base. In the reflecting surface, I could see them clearly now, all the others who had stood here, reading from this same book, accepting this same responsibility. Giuseppe, as a young man, faced serious with undertaking weight. His father before him and his father before that, stretching back through generations of willing vessels who had each played their part in this centuries-long preparation. Words I spoke weren't my own, but they felt more familiar than my own thoughts. Like a song I'd been humming unconsciously forever, finally hearing the complete melody. I was agreeing to something, accepting a role I'd been genetically programmed to fulfill, but specific terms were becoming irrelevant. The choice had been made before my birth, encoded in DNA like an inherited condition, manifesting only under proper circumstances. When I finished reading, the chamber fell into perfect silence. Melted wax had formed a flawless circle around my feet, smooth and reflective as dark mirror. In its surface, I could see myself, but also them. All previous vessels, an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries, each standing in this same position, reading from this same book, accepting this same burden and privilege. I closed the book, and wax began solidifying around my ankles. Not trapping, but anchoring, keeping me stable while final transformation completed itself. Because that's what this was, not possession or corruption, but evolution. The entity dormant in my bloodstream forever was finally ready to emerge fully, and it needed a willing host to complete metamorphosis. I felt it happening gradually, like warm honey flowing through my circulatory system. Thoughts becoming clearer, sharper, filled with knowledge I'd never acquired, and memories I'd never personally experienced. I could see the monastery during its operational period, filled with monks who weren't entirely human anymore, tending something requiring constant vigilance to prevent catastrophic escape. I could see the network of containment sites across Europe and beyond, each holding a fragment of something larger, something deliberately separated centuries ago to prevent reassembly. Santa Lucia was one node in a vast web of control points, and I was one vessel in a bloodline cultivated specifically for this purpose. But most clearly, I could see what came next. The Archivum Nigrum was waiting when I finally emerged from the chamber. Not physically present, but I could sense their attention like atmospheric pressure before storms. They'd been monitoring, remotely, waiting for transformation completion, and now they were ready to welcome their newest operational asset. I walked out of Santa Lucia as dawn painted Italian sky in gold and crimson, but I was no longer the same person who had entered. Knowledge filling my mind was vast and ancient, stretching back to periods before recorded history. I understood things about reality most humans weren't equipped to comprehend, could perceive patterns and connections existing in spaces between what people accepted as normal. 2 years later, I've been working for them officially as a translator and researcher with an apartment in Rome, modest salary, and life appearing completely normal from external perspectives. Unofficially, I'm something else entirely. A bridge between what the world accepts as real and what actually exists in darkness between established categories. There are others like me, scattered globally, other bloodlines, other vessels, other ancient agreements keeping reality's fundamental machinery operating within acceptable parameters. We rarely interact directly, but we recognize each other when paths cross. There's a quality to our presence, gravitational field coming from being anchored to something much larger and older than individual human existence. Most people can't detect it consciously, but those who can usually find excuses to avoid prolonged contact. The work is remarkably varied. Sometimes I translate documents never intended for human comprehension. Sometimes I travel to locations where dimensional barriers have grown dangerously thin and require reinforcement. Sometimes I serve as communication channel, allowing something ancient and knowledgeable to speak through me to church officials, needing guidance on matters beyond normal expertise. It's not unpleasant. The entity sharing my biological space doesn't cause pain or discomfort, doesn't conflict with personal thoughts and preferences. More like having an extremely knowledgeable roommate who occasionally needs to borrow my physical form for important business. Most of the time, I remain myself. Still, Nathan Vale, with his own memories and personality and individual quirks. But sometimes, when work requires it, I become something much more. I dream about the monastery regularly, but they're not nightmares anymore. More like consultations, conversations with the part of myself that existed long before birth and will continue long after individual awareness fades. In those dreams, I can see the complete scope of what we're maintaining, the vast network of containment facilities and monitoring stations and human assets keeping the world balanced precariously between order and chaos. It's beautiful in its way. Terrifying but undeniably beautiful. My sister called last month. She'd had a baby, she told me excitedly. A little boy with bright, curious eyes and Giuseppe's distinctive chin. She'd named him David, after our father, and wanted to know if I'd serve as godfather. I accepted immediately. Family connections are crucial, especially in our line of work. I've established a trust fund for David's education. Private schools with excellent language programs, finest tutors available, special emphasis on Latin, Italian, and older tongues not taught in conventional academic settings. He'll need those skills when his time arrives. The Archivum Nigrum is extraordinarily patient but remarkably thorough. They've been guiding the Vale family's development for generations, directing our evolution with the same careful attention a master gardener shows prized orchids, each generation stronger than the previous, more suitable for our destined role, and David represents the culmination of all that patient cultivation. He's only 8 months old, but I can already see the signs. The way he stares at shadows that move when they shouldn't. The way electronics malfunction when he cries. The way his reflection sometimes shows things that aren't there. He'll grow up normally mostly. Make friends, attend school, fall in love, maybe have children of his own. But when he turns 28, the same age I was when I found that document, he'll start having dreams. Dreams that will guide him to a place he's never been, but knows intimately. And when that day comes, I'll be there to help him through the transformation, just as Giuseppe should have been there for me if things had gone according to plan. The covenant continues. It always continues. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that Vatican document. If I'd just packed Giuseppe's belongings and returned to my normal life. But I know that's wishful thinking. The pull would have found me eventually, drawn me south whether I understood or not. This was always inevitable. The choice was made before my birth, written into my genetic code like a hereditary disease that lies dormant until the right conditions trigger its awakening. I'm not a victim. I'm not even really a willing participant. I'm a completion, the fulfillment of something that began centuries ago and will continue long after my individual contribution has been absorbed into the larger pattern. And I'm exactly where I've always been meant to be. Late at night, when Rome sleeps and the weight of what I carry feels heaviest, I stand on my balcony and look south towards the mountains. I can sense Santa Lucia out there, patient and watchful, tended by new guardians who understand their role in the greater design. The monastery isn't empty anymore. It hasn't been since I completed the ritual. Now it houses something that had been sleeping too long, something that needed a proper vessel to anchor it back to the physical realm where it could be monitored and contained. Tourists who make it past the warnings report strange things. Lights in windows that should be dark, sounds that carry impossibly far, figures in brown robes who watch from the cliff face but vanish when observed directly. The authorities dismiss these as imagination, tricks of light in a place with too much history. They're probably right, mostly. But sometimes, when conditions align and barriers grow thin, people see things more real than they're equipped to process. That's acceptable. The world functions better when most people remain unaware of what's happening in the spaces between official narrative and truth. My phone rings. A number I don't recognize, though something about it feels familiar. The call I've been expecting. Hello? The voice is young, nervous, accented. Is this Nathan Vale? Speaking. My name is David Reyes. I'm calling from Barcelona. I found something in my grandfather's papers after his funeral, and I think you might be able to help me understand what it means. I settle back in my chair, already reaching for my travel calendar. What kind of something, David? A document, with a Vatican seal. It has a list of locations, and this will sound insane, but I think my name is on it. It doesn't sound insane at all, I assure him. Where are you now? At home, in Barcelona. But I keep thinking about this place mentioned in the document. Monasterio de las Sombras, in the Pyrenees. I've never heard of it, but I can't stop thinking about it. It's like something is pulling me there. That's completely normal, I tell him, opening my laptop to check flights. That feeling will intensify over the next few days. Don't fight it. You know what this is about, don't you? I know exactly what it's about. And David? Yes? Welcome to the family. I end the call and start making arrangements. Barcelona is beautiful this time of year, and and I've always found great satisfaction in guiding new vessels through their initial transformation. It's one of the more rewarding aspects of the work, watching someone discover their true nature, what they've always been destined to become. David Reyes, 28 years old according to the file I'm accessing, university graduate with degrees in linguistics and medieval history, no family history of mental instability, excellent physical health. Most importantly, his bloodline shows all the correct genetic markers. The Reyes family has been under observation almost as long as the Vales, carefully guided through generations of selective breeding and environmental conditioning. He'll make an exceptional vessel. I book a flight for tomorrow morning and send a brief message to my supervisors. They don't need details. They already know where I'm going and why. Outside my window, Rome sleeps under stars that seem brighter than they should be. In the distance, church bells chime midnight, their bronze voices carrying messages in frequencies most people can't hear, but that resonate in my bones like perfectly tuned instruments. The covenant continues. It always continues. And somewhere in Barcelona, a young man named David Reyes is staring at a document he doesn't understand, feeling a compulsion he can't explain, taking the first steps on a journey that will lead him exactly where he's supposed to be, just as it led me, just as it will lead whoever comes after him. The wheel turns, the pattern completes itself, and the ancient things that sleep in the darkness between worlds continue to dream their patient dreams, anchored to reality by bloodlines that stretch back to the very beginning of recorded time and beyond. I close my laptop and pour myself wine, something rich and dark that reminds me of underground chambers and secrets carved in stone. Tomorrow, I'll fly to Barcelona and meet David Reyes. I'll help him understand what he's becoming, guide him through the transformation that awaits in the mountains north of the city. I'll watch him discover the truth about his family, his bloodline, his purpose. And when it's finished, when he's taken his place in the network of vessels and guardians that maintains global stability, I'll return to Rome and wait for the next call. Because there will always be a next call. The covenant continues. It always continues. And in the dark spaces between what people know and what they fear to imagine, ancient entities stir in their eternal sleep and smile with borrowed faces, content in the knowledge that their patient plans are proceeding exactly as designed, just as they always have, just as they always will. The wax figure on my dresser turns its head slightly as I pass, its melted features arranging themselves into what might be approval or hunger. In this business, the distinction isn't always clear. But that's perfectly fine. After all, we are exactly where we belong.